Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided. This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlaw Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlaw Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
Welcome back. Access to Democracy. And what can I say about our next guest? The Civil Liberties Union protects us all, and Chuck Samuelson really oversees the Minnesota Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU of Minnesota, to make sure that we are protected.
I'm almost embarrassed, Alan.
He's been doing it for quite a while.
Yep.
He has roots from Syracuse University, as do I. So we have that in common with a team that's 10-0 right now in basketball, although with some trepidation about several of their wins.
December doesn't count. Only March matters.
That's it. Now, I think we should go right to the quack issue. Duck Dynasty. The patriarch of Duck Dynasty made some really untoward remarks about homosexuality, and A&E Network put him on leave.
Right.
We discussed this quite a bit this morning on AM 950 when I sat in on the morning grind. Where do you come down on it before I tell you where I did?
Well, I mean, there's no First Amendment issue. You don't have a free speech right in corporations. He has no more rights than anybody who tells their boss off has a right to keep his or her job. So as far as we were concerned, it's a non-issue. We don't take positions on questions of taste, and outside of government statements, we don't take positions on accuracy or anything else.
And what a lot of people don't understand is the First Amendment, freedom of speech, regards government contact. It doesn't regard what you do in your private life, or, for instance, in his case, I understand that he had to sign a waiver of things that he would not do for the station, and he breached that. Well, he's employed by a private employer who has the right to do what they will with him.
Right. I mean, you can argue about whether or not that's, it ought to be that way, but that is the way it is.
And there is a big difference between putting a sign out, expressing your feelings and having government come down on you, or writing in chalk on the sidewalk telling people not to enlist. And what happened there? The ACLU got involved.
Right. Well, our client was arrested by security rent-a-cops, charged by a Minneapolis police officer, and banned from basically from trespassing on the public streets of the city of Minneapolis.
Don't you walk on this sidewalk.
Exactly.
As you say.
And so we sued on her behalf because freedom of assembly and freedom of speech are closely interrelated, and there's quintessentially the place where it is closest is on the public sidewalks. You're not impeding traffic. You're not, in her case, she did no damage, and she was expressing a purely political point of view.
And she didn't do it with paint. She did it with
chalk.
With chalk, which
So
disappears in the first rainstorm.
Exactly. And so when we won, we protected the rights of 10-year-old girls everywhere to play hopscotch on the city sidewalks.
But that's the type of thing
Yes.
that the ACLU will do. On the other side of the coin, the ACLU will come to protect the rights of Nazis to have a parade in Skokie, Illinois,
Right.
even though what they stand for is abhorrent to everything that most of us stand for.
And in a classic case of, like the Duck Dynasty guy, to go back to that, 20% of the ACLU's membership quit because of that decision, which was the right decision to do.
The Skokie decision.
The Skokie decision. For the ACLU to defend the Nazis' right to speak is absolutely, quintessentially, the purest constitutional decision you could have. The result of that, the result of our free speech, was that individuals declined to support us, 20% of our membership. And it was a very close thing with the ACLU.
But a lot of people don't understand it. What worried me is I was on the same side as Fox News last night in terms of the Duck Dynasty situation.
Yeah.
And whenever I find myself on the same side with Megyn Kelly and that crew, I get very nervous.
You know, the constitutional rights are constitutional rights, and they can't be taken away by government. By the same token, corporations are not bound by the Constitution, and frankly, neither are individuals
They
in their
should be,
transactions.
because corporations are people. We know that now.
That's true. I'd forgotten that. I was delusional for a moment.
If corporations are people, they should be bound by the same thing that all the rest of us are bound by. Thank you, Citizens United. Thank you,
Yeah.
Chief Justice Roberts.
Yeah, thank you, Chief Justice Roberts. Although the Citizens United case, in a narrow portion of it, we agreed, and that is that a corporation, and the ACLU is a corporation. Don't forget. So are the Take Action and Planned Parenthood. These are all corporations.
MoveOn.org.
MoveOn.org. These are all corporations, and you know, at a certain point, should these groups have a right to influence elections by advertising and not be bound by the time limits and the contribution limits, et cetera, that the act put on people. The fact that it was Citizens United and that many people on the left disagree with their position on a number of issues shouldn't blind people to the fact that you're really talking about the right of any corporation, any union, any nonprofit organization to express the issues and the thoughts of their members on the political process. So it is, the ACLU is a bit ambivalent about Citizens United. We think it went too far, but we also think, and we also recognize, that every attempt to regulate political speech has blown up in people's faces going back to the 60s. And what we really need to do is talk about a different way of financing political campaigns. And that's what the debate should be about.
That would be wonderful if we could do that. If we could get lobbyists out of political campaigns, lobbyists away from writing really legislation that they just hand to legislators, ALEC, and get them away from participating so that it could be a pure election. I mean, England has a much purer election system than we do.
Well, yes and no. Remember, that's the country where the paper would get politicians elected, and they would tap people's phones, and they would bribe people, and they were getting all sorts of information.
Well, we tap people's phones. We have an NSA.
We have an NSA.
Anything that we're saying right now is probably being stored someplace.
Well, I'm sure of that. Anything that's digital is storable. So, but my point is that the English system, they don't have a First Amendment. They don't have a lot of things we don't have, and they have no protection against tyranny of the majority. Because remember, their executive branch and their legislative branch are one and the same, and their judiciary has no constitution. It is simply based on
well, true,
stare
which is one of the
decisis.
reasons that we have our Constitution.
Exactly.
But yes, to all of those things, yes, they have a much more intelligent way of running elections.
Shorter. That's the key.
6 weeks.
6 weeks instead
8
of
weeks,
2 years.
And you don't have all this money pouring in that we have here.
If it was a 6-week campaign, we wouldn't have all this money pouring in.
That's right.
Because you couldn't spend it fast enough.
And it would be a much purer election.
It would be much different. I don't know how pure it would be.
Oh,
I'll be
I think it
happy.
would be.
I'll be happy to give you credit on that. I'm just too cynical.
Now, our Secretary of State recently started online voting registration.
Right.
Immediately raised a firestorm.
Right. From the same people, by the way, who brought you the voter ID amendment. It's
Well,
the same
it's-
cast of characters.
There is a, to put it that way, a cast of characters who doesn't want everybody to exercise the vote, who will take great steps to keep people away from the polls rather than encouraging them to the polls. Our former Secretary of State was one of them. And
Yep.
Mark Ritchie has done just the opposite. So, but you, the ACLU, when I say you, got involved in what has been a lawsuit to knock all those people off the polls, off the rolls, which would be manifestly unfair.
Well, let me just say that the ACLU is a firm believer in universal suffrage, universal being the proper word. You know, I went to elementary school at Union Street Elementary, and my teacher did not think that 70% was an acceptable grade. More importantly, my parents didn't think that 70% was an acceptable grade. And that's what we're celebrating, that in Minnesota, 70% of the people who could vote actually voted. And we're happy with that. The ACLU is not happy with that. We believe that our goal should be a 100% of the people being able to vote. So for that reason, number one, we filed an amicus brief in the district court, which is very rare.
A friend of the court brief.
A friend of the court brief in the first trial, which is very, very rare. There aren't even rules of procedure to allow you to do that. We just asked the judge, and the judge said, yeah, send it to us. So we did. And in our brief, we said, we take no position on whether or not the facts in this case are such that would allow the online registration. There's an argument to be made on both sides. But clearly, no matter how this case turns out, the 2,000 plus people who've already registered have to have their registration be allowed to stand.
And should not be penalized.
Because the remedy for an improper procedure is not to ditch all the people that have registered. And the other side, the cast of characters on the other side, rather reluctantly admitted in open court that the ACLU's position was right on that, and that even if they prevailed in the trial, the people who were already registered were already registered. That being said, the ACLU is not entirely sure that the other side's case is as strong as they seem to believe it is. There's several different laws that regulate actions of government, one of which allows for online registration and online interaction with the government. The voting rights law doesn't mention online at all. They simply talk about a mail-in ballot. All the information that's online is what's required for registering. Period, comma, everything is exactly the same as it is on the mail-in form. The only difference is the manner of conveyance. And the judge could rule that that makes all the difference in the world. We would hope that he doesn't. But even if that happens,
To be decided.
that's right. This is right, to be decided.
Police are now carrying cameras.
Right.
Many of them.
On their lapels, they call it.
Lapels or in their caps,
Yep.
both. The ACLU has raised an eyebrow about this.
But only
Why?
Well, here's the thing. If the police, let's step back. If you are walking in public streets, you have no expectation of privacy. Neither should law enforcement. And the peace officers who are going about their duty are as much in the public eye as you and I are. And if we have no rights to privacy, then they have no rights to privacy. This business of the camera is so that they can refute charges of police brutality or improper behavior against them. And the ACLU's position is quite simple. If you're going to have it on, you have it on. But if you're turning it off and on at the officer's discretion, that's unacceptable, and you can't use it for your own defense because quite clearly it is a manipulated kind of a thing. And that being said, if you are designing a system where it's always on, it is not subject to the control of the individual officer, then the ACLU thinks it might be a useful tool.
They have found it very useful in police cars where they record arrests and have also recorded some criminal conduct. I actually think that any time a person is interrogated, there should be a camera present for the entire interrogation.
That's required in Minnesota, I believe.
It is, but it's not required every place.
No, it's not required in Wisconsin. And that famous FBI guy who got all these people to confess, it turns out he was breaking the law like crazy, and they caught him in Minnesota with those cameras. And I don't know that he can come to the state without fear of arrest.
Well, that's a good thing.
I think so.
Government tracking license plates.
Oy.
Should the government be tracking our license plates, where we're going, what we're doing? Is this Big Brother's final intrusion into our private lives?
Well, the ACLU would say yes to the latter. We are deeply concerned about hyper-policing. We are deeply concerned about what we perceive to be an abuse of the Fourth Amendment in terms of warrants and the gathering of information.
Because it is, in fact, a search and seizure
Exactly.
in a way.
It's a search. And we are deeply concerned about the interest that the police have in not only capturing people's images and capturing information, but never giving it up and keeping it all on computer files, because computer files are cheap. In the case of these privacy areas, which is what we lump all this into, there will be legislative hearings. Representative John Lesch has called for legislative hearings on the Kingfisher portable cell tower, which the Hennepin Sheriff and the BCA and the FBI and the U.S. Marshal Service have in Minnesota. It's called for hearings on that, hearings on these license plate readers, which are not as innocuous as people claim, because they tell you not only where you are, but when you were there and what direction you're traveling, and they never forget anything, and it gets saved, and so your progress around the area can be tracked. We're also
and they can throw that license plate number into a computer,
right,
and utilize it for really things that have nothing to do with whatever you happen to be charged with at the moment.
Exactly. And these are people who are not charged with anything. You're simply charged with breathing. And that's something that the ACLU has a huge problem with. This collection of data, because we can collect the data and we'll figure out a use for it, is crazy. These license plate readers, they haven't solved any crimes. They haven't done anything that would justify their cost nor their relative intrusiveness. So we're not a fan of those. And we're not a fan of the fact that the police departments feel they can keep this information forever and build dossiers on every one of us. And I don't care if you're innocent or you're guilty. You do not have to have a dossier with you on you by the public
It's akin
official.
to what the NSA is doing with telephone calls.
Exactly.
And not only telephone calls, but texting and phone calls of all sorts,
Well,
cell phone calls.
and where you go online and what you buy at Amazon and what you look at it on Amazon, all that information is being collected by NSA. The FBI is using private companies. Remember that private companies don't have to obey the Constitution. They use private companies to gather data on you that the FBI can't get on you. Then the FBI gets that data that they buy from these private companies. Now they have the data that they couldn't otherwise collect. How could that possibly be legal? I'm not a lawyer, but it strikes me as, it makes my head hurt. And so, there's going to be hearings. There's going to be hearings on all that stuff. Drones. You know that Red Lake is a drone testing area, the Red Lake Indian Reservation.
Another thing I was going to bring up. No, I didn't know that was a drone testing area.
Well, sure. And you got up in Grand Forks, North Dakota. The University of North Dakota has a whole major in operating these drones, remotely operating drones. It's a beautiful thing.
It's a beautiful thing in a horrible way.
Exactly. It's an awful thing.
Yeah. Edward Snowden, hero or traitor?
Little both, I suspect. I mean, I have a hard time putting people on a pedestal, and I have a hard time kicking them to the dustbin. Some things that Eric Snowden has done, I think, are very useful. The most important thing is making most of Americans aware of the reach of the government into their private lives. And while Obama has...
We have no private lives.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? And you can't... One of the things about America that really made it great are things like the bankruptcy laws. You can reinvent yourself. You can survive bad decisions. You used to be able to survive bad decisions, but you can't anymore. You take that and you double it combine it with a vindictive personality and prosecutorial abuse of prosecutorial discretion, which frankly is a huge sin, and the government needs to, our representatives need to address that. Prosecutors have entirely too much power, and they have no consequences for any of their decisions, which makes some sense, frankly, the ACLU believes. But on the other hand, we think their powers are too much and that they need to be reined in.
And I would have to agree with you in that regard. Yes, Snowden did open the doors and open our eyes to a lot of things, and we're finding more and more now about just how far the NSA has gone into intruding in our lives.
They've been lying to Congress, for goodness sake. If you lied to Congress or I lied to Congress, where would we be sitting today? Not here.
No, we wouldn't.
We'd be in the Iron Bar Hotel.
We have orange suits on.
Yes,
and,
exactly.
Yeah.
We'd be shackled if we left.
Yeah, and I'm disappointed in many respects in President Obama with regard to privacy and the NSA and things like that, because what he ran on is not where he's gone. I think he's become a corporatist in many respects, and for all the good things that he wants to do, I can't forgive those things.
My expectations of President Obama were never as high as some people's were, nor were they as low as other people's were. I think if I have a criticism of President Obama, it is that he has overreached, abused his executive powers. But you know what? Every president has. I expected better from him for no good reason. I should have known better.
That doesn't make it right.
It doesn't make it right. It just makes it common as dirt. Mm-hmm. My biggest complaint with President Obama is that I'm not sure that the people that he's put into power and his staff are entirely competent. I think they're arrogant, smart people who think that because they're brainiacs, they're better than everybody else, and it turns out, oops, they're not.
That's very dangerous also.
It is, and I think that it's the old Enron thing, the smartest people in the room.
Now, what's going on with ACLU of Minnesota that we don't know about, that you can talk about?
Well, let's see. Speaking of privacy, we just settled the Facebook case out of Gaylord, which will be announced in probably sometime in the end of December. Fundamentally, we got changes in the school's behavior. The facts of the case are pretty simple. 12-year-old girl writes an email to a bunch of her friends saying such and such a hall monitor's a jerk. The next day she's called in the office and interrogated by the social worker, because it turns out that most school districts have somebody whose job it is to spy on what's being said about their school.
That's incredible.
It is an incredible waste of money. I mean, I know that
to say nothing of the intrusion into their lives.
To say nothing of, when I was a kid, I had a teacher and her nickname was Irk the Jerk. I'm sure you never had a teacher that you made fun of like that, but we made horrible fun of her.
My students talk that way about me.
Well, it's probably justified in your case. I'm just saying. The point is that we talked smack about our teachers and our school, to use the sort of more current vernacular, all the time. We just didn't do it online because online hadn't been invented. But everybody knew about it, and everybody sort of accepted it. It was just kids blowing off steam. These days, not so much. So anyway, they called her in. She went back home after school that day. She was pretty upset.
Was she suspended or not?
Well, we're getting to that.
Oh, okay.
So then the next day, she sends a post on her. She has a website, which I don't have, but she had a website, and on her website she said, "Who the Effenheimer told these jerks about what I said?" So then she goes to school, and at that time she gets nabbed by a principal or assistant principal and a sheriff's deputy armed, and they sit down and interrogate her, asking her to give up her passwords to her Facebook and her passwords to her website, which after 3 hours she did. Now, at no time did they contact or give her an opportunity to contact an attorney or her parents.
And of course they had a warrant.
Yeah, about that.
Yeah.
They had no warrant, and they had no warrant because she was engaging in quintessentially protected speech.
Free speech.
Free speech, her website, her Facebook account, done from her home, never used anything to do with the schools. The only school computer that was involved was the principals and the social workers whose job it was to track what these kids were saying in their off hours. So we sued. And the school...
And you won.
Yes, and we won. And so that'll be announced. So the chalking case, we just won that case. You're aware of that we're in the lawsuit against Secretary of State Ritchie.
Now, schools will say that what we're trying to do is protect students because we want to catch dangerous speech. We want to catch people who are making threats to bodily harm. We want to catch people who might be entering schools with weapons and things like that. So we have to do this. That would be the answer of the schools.
Yeah, poppycock, balderdash, and other words that aren't fit for. I mean, it's just not true. What it is the schools want to enforce a code of obedience 24/7. And that's what our schools have become. When you read about the school to prison pipeline, this is the kind of stuff you're talking about. This is the kind of behavior that schools have where there is absolutely no way for anybody to express themselves in any way. And if you cross the line, you get suspended, which is what happened to this young lady. And if you get suspended, you then get expelled because you become part of the usual suspects. And anything that happens, you get blamed.
And it goes on your record.
And it goes on your record.
It can affect you for the rest of your
Exactly,
life. It
forever.
can affect you for a college admission.
For scholarships, for the
Right.
whole 9 yards.
This
That's
kid
right.
is a troublemaker.
That's right, exactly. And so these are simply, from our point of view, abuses of power that do nothing but weaken the educational system. And at a time when we're talking about spending millions of more dollars and trying to solve these huge racial disparity gaps between the school performance of white students and students of color. When you talk about all the sorts of things that pile on to these behavior problems, as you mentioned, at a certain point, I think we need to remember that these are kids, these are children. And if we want to raise a nation of robots, let's have that discussion. And let's show how raising a nation of American robots helps American robots to compete against Asian robots. I'd love to have that discussion.
Well, I think we should mention at this point, and we're really at the end of the interview, that the ACLU doesn't take fees in these cases.
Nope.
The ACLU does what it does for the protection of the individual. No fees. It's privately funded.
No government money.
No government money at all.
We can use everybody's money except the government's. We need $1 million a year to run. We have offices around the state. We represent racial justice issues we're doing a lawsuit in Gaylord right now because of our plaintiff was arrested for the crime of having more melanin than me. So if you're darker than me, you probably should support the ACLU simply because we support rights for people who look darker than me.
That's it. They will take anybody's case whose civil rights have been violated, and they do it without cost to the person
that's right.
who's the victim. You've been watching Chuck Samuelson, the executive director of the ACLU of Minnesota. Always a pleasure. Come back again.
Well, thanks, Alan. You just have to invite me. I show up.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks.